Thank you for joining us today for our seminar in the Journey to Science series at Onondaga Community College. This seminar is sponsored by the Bridges to Baccalaureate grant. Today, we are welcoming Dr. Heather Coleman. Dr. Coleman is Associate Chair of Biology at Syracuse University and holds degrees in forestry and biotechnology. Her research focuses on the genetics of wood formation and why trees grow as tall as they do. As you're watching, if you have any questions, there's a question and answer button at the top of the screen, and you can submit your questions at any time during the talk, and we will be sure to cover those either during the talk or at the end. Dr. Coleman, thank you for sharing your time and your story with us. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm very excited to be here. I'm just going to pull up some notes because I'm not going to wing it completely today, but I want to thank everyone who's joined us. I really am excited to talk to you about my experience and sort of how I got from a very young child to who I am now, which my daughter tells me is very old. So as Dr. Hamilton said, I'm currently an associate professor at Syracuse University. I'm also the associate chair of the biology department, and that involves also being the director of the undergraduate studies program. So I sort of interact a lot with our undergraduates. I also will put in a shameless plug here for SU that there's lots of support for undergraduate research at Syracuse. And so if you're looking at the next step, that's a great thing to look into. And our department actually has interacted quite closely with OCC in sort of the recent past, trying to build connections and trying to attract more students from your institution to come here for summer research positions and stuff like that. So we're excited about engaging with you as students at OCC. So I'm going to start sort of at the beginning and work chronologically through things. I do encourage questions if you have questions at any point, but I'm going to start actually in rural Alberta. So Alberta is a province in Western Canada. If you go all the way to the western side of Canada, you have British Columbia, and then the next province is Alberta. And Alberta is really a farming province and an oil province. So I grew up in a town of about 2,000 people. I grew up on a dairy farm, and so without knowing it really, I was exposed to biology very early on, and to this idea of the circle of life and all types of biology that are involved in farming. My parents are both immigrants, so they came to Canada from the Netherlands. My dad came over by himself when he was 16 years old, so he had a grade 6 education, and when he came to Canada, he started working on a farm, and eventually with sort of community help, he eventually saved up and bought his own farm. And so that was my sort of growing up situation, was growing up on this farm. My mom finished high school and had a job teaching, and I think her teaching actually helped to supplement the farm at the beginning. If any of you grew up on farms, you'll know that it's hard work. It's not always the most lucrative work. I think maybe farming is undervalued in society, considering they provide all our food, but yeah, so I think that there were, I was very fortunate, but we also worked very hard. But farming was an interesting place to start. And if you think about farming and you think about biology, you're learning about plant biology, you're learning about animal biology, reproductive biology, developmental biology, and a lot of sort of hard physical work on top of that. And so I sort of look at farming as my start in biology. So I grew up being very engaged in the farm. So I did sort of all of the things from helping with sort of planting and harvesting, milking cows, feeding animals, pretty much everything that happened on the farm I had a hand in as sort of from probably about 8 years old until I left home. During the 6 years after I finished high school and did my undergraduate degree, I also became sort of passionate about hiking and traveling. And so I took a year off of school. I wasn't entirely sure what I wanted to do, which I don't think is an uncommon situation to be in when you're doing your undergraduate degree. And I worked for quite a while to save money. And then I spent 4 months backpacking in South America. In the summers, I essentially spent every weekend possible hiking and camping. I lived in British Columbia at this point, and British Columbia is west of the Rockies, but it's very, very mountainous. There's lots of alpine, and I spent a lot of time in the alpine environment. And so my recreational activities were biology too. So I grew up farming, that's biology, and my recreational activities were biology. But I hadn't quite figured it out yet, right? So I hadn't quite figured out that I was going to be a biologist. So I spend my summers during my sort of early undergraduate degree planting trees. In Western Canada, forestry is predominantly done on land that's owned by the government. And so the government leases their land to forestry companies who harvest, and they have a requirement that they actually have to reforest the areas that they log once they've logged those areas. And so they pay predominantly sort of college students and people of that age to carry large loads of trees and walk around in cut blocks and plant trees every 1.3 meters. This is I don't know if any of you have seen this or know anything about this. It's a very, very hard physical job. You get paid per tree, and so the tree prices ranged from sort of 7 cents per tree up to anywhere up to 50 cents per tree. And it depended on a whole bunch of things. It depended on what the sort of topography was like. So if you were on really steep ground, you tended to get paid more. It depended on what the soil was like. So really rocky soil, you tended to get paid more. So it actually, in some cases, you could make a lot more in a day if you were on, 7 cent ground than if you were on 50 cent ground, because you could move faster and you could actually sort of physically move faster and get more trees in the ground, and so you made more money that way. But it's a really sort of strange way to be paid and strange way to work. You either make a lot of money or you don't make any money. And when you're starting out, you really don't make any money. So you pay to live in a camp. The company that hires tree planters provides a camp. And it's essentially, you have like temporary structures that are a cook tent, temporary structures that are a dining tent, and a temporary structure that's a shower, although frequently it's so cold that you don't want to shower anyway. And then you bring your own tent and you live in these camps, and you get up at like 5 in the morning. You go and work sort of a 10 to 12 hour day. You come back, somebody cooks for you, which is awesome. I probably appreciate more now than I did then how nice it is to have somebody cook for you. But it's amazing and it's terrible, right? And so this, I guess this was I would call this one of my best life experiences, right? Like, this was some place where I learned to work hard. I lived in a community with people who were all sort of in the same boat, which, as I'm saying this out loud, it kind of actually starts to remind me of grad school. So because you are working hard and you're experiencing this sort of life-changing experience with a group of people or with a cohort. But the other benefit of this is that I was able to finish college without debt, because it is a fairly lucrative job once you've done it a number of times. And the caveat being that I went to school in Canada. Canada is funded very, very differently than it is in the US, or education is funded very, very differently. But the reason that I sort of am talking about tree planting so much is that it actually had a huge impact on what I ended up doing, right? So you've heard that I study trees, and really growing up in Alberta is fairly flat. It's prairie land. I didn't have a lot of exposure to the outdoors, yes, but to trees and natural settings. And so going out and tree planting and living in the woods in a tent for sort of months on end had a really big impact on where I ended up going. It also, as I said, it introduced me to the field that would shape my career. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the things that we did in addition to tree planting. So I ended up working in forestry for quite a few sort of summers or seasons. And we did lots of weird things at the time. You got told to do something and you did it. And now in hindsight, I'm like, that's like, I wish I had questioned more. And I think maybe because I didn't question more, it's why I ended up in forestry. We did things like we would go into a cut block that had been planted before, but had plant trees that were unhealthy. So they'd have trees that were sort of maybe waist height, but there would be something wrong with them. So in some cases, I remember weevils. Oh, there's the orange alert. So if you can hear an alarm in the background, they're testing the orange alert system. So we would go into the field, and there would be little spruce trees about waist height that would have the top of the tree would essentially be bent over and sort of curled up on itself. And we had to pick those while we were planting trees. We would plant a tree beside it. We would pick the bud off, and we would have to step on it, because it would have a spruce weevil in it, which is an insect that actually kills the trees and causes them to be misshapen and eventually kills them. We planted sticks. This sounds a little weird. So some trees will actually, so poplar is a great example. So poplar is the species that I use in my research. But poplar trees, if you cut off a branch and you stick it into the ground, as long as it gets enough water, it will start to produce new roots and start to grow again. Even if it doesn't have any sort of leaves on it or anything. It's a really resilient tree. In fact, it's one of the ways that poplar actually sort of expands. I was going to say reproduce, but that's not quite true. A branch can fall off a poplar tree and land on the ground and create a whole new tree. So that was another weird thing we did. I don't know how successful that was. I never went back to check that one. Other weird things we did. We had a lot of trouble with deer browsing. And so if you live in Syracuse, you know that deer like to go into everyone's yard and eat all their best plants, right? They really like these little tender plants. And they like little trees too. So we would plant trees and then we would go back and the deer would have eaten them. So someone had this great idea to detract deer, you need to attract cougars and predators. And so we would actually, this is really gross, we would actually and this was like a trial being done by a forestry company, that they would get reconstituted pig's blood from butchers, and we would have to dip the trees in pig's blood before we planted them. That actually wasn't the grossest thing I've ever had to do, but that was close to the grossest thing I've ever had to do. I grew up on a farm, so I spent my childhood doing things that many people would find extremely gross that I won't go into. But dipping trees in pig's blood and then having to carry them around and plant them was right up there. So sort of after a couple of summers of figuring out what I wanted to do and doing a bit of traveling and doing a lot of working, I decided I was going to go to university and that I was going to be a teacher. So when I was a kid, you essentially had a short list of things that you could do, and it was farmer, doctor, teacher, lawyer. I didn't know any lawyers or doctors personally. I knew I didn't want to spend my life on a farm, and so teacher seemed like the other option. Like I said, I grew up in a town of 2,000 people, and so I just wasn't exposed to lots of the opportunities that are out there. I did well in university. For some reason, I like to learn, and so things came relatively easily to me, and I did really well in my first year. And so I got letters from a bunch of different programs inviting me to join their departments. And so at that point, I was like, there are other options, right? I don't have to be a teacher. And so I decided I was going to go into business. And I decided that for all of about 3 months. I never actually ended up taking any business courses because I realized that, I'm laughing because Dr. Hamilton and I were having a conversation before about how biology professors dress, and biology professors and people who work in finance and in business dress very differently. And this was actually a warning sign to me because I was at University of British Columbia, which is in Vancouver, and I saw the business students, and they were all sort of in suits and all dressed up every day. And I was like, I can't do that. This is not the career for me. I might be interested in it. I might be able to succeed at it. But I just don't see myself fitting in there in the long term. So another sort of weird fun fact about me is that I was actually, I was married before I started my undergraduate degree, which I know is odd. But my husband was going to university at the same time as me, and he was taking forestry classes. And so I was taking sort of my general, I think we were in a college of arts and sciences. I was in a college of arts and sciences. And so I was taking all kinds of courses and I enjoyed them all. But the reality is that I would get home at the end of the day and I would read his notes from his classes. So he was taking a tree biology class. It's called dendrology, so the study of trees. And he would come home with his notes, and that was all I wanted to do at night, was to talk to him about the things that he was learning and to read his notes. And it was really exciting for me to be able to put together. So I told you my summer job was tree planting. We were doing all these weird things, and it was super exciting to me to be able to take the information that he was learning in his class and see sort of what I had been doing in my job and why I had been doing it. And so that was exciting for me too. And so that's another example where the things that I was enjoying doing and the things that I was passionate about actually turned out to be biology, even though I wasn't totally aware of it at the time. So I think at this point, sort of realizing how excited I was about the forestry program and about tree biology, that's really where my trajectory changed. So I joined the forestry program at UBC, and I did a degree in natural resource management. And I feel like I was really fortunate to be able to do that. I feel like it took sort of the things that I love, so being in nature and being in the forest, and it allowed me to sort of learn the biology of it. And it also took sort of, I already knew how I could turn it into a career. Like I already knew I could go and work in forestry, and I could just sort of, I could do the work. I knew how it would work. I could see the future, right? Like there wasn't a, oh boy, I'm taking a risk by doing something where I don't know where it's going to get me. So there was like some comfort in that. But I say that because I've now ended up in a very different career than I thought I was going into. So I think one of the sort of themes of what I'm talking about today is that you might see yourself going in a specific direction, but to keep your eye out for what the different trajectories are that you could turn to, right? Yeah. So in my third year in the forestry program, I had to take a course that was despised by everyone. It was a course on linear programming, which sounds maybe weird for forestry, but it kind of has to do with like production and efficiencies and stuff like that. And I think you either got it or you didn't. And the reality is that most people didn't. And for some reason, again, it worked for me. It was, I use the word magic. Like I just got it. And I could help people a little bit, but there was just something about it that was really intuitive to me. And this, I say this because this course actually, again, changed the trajectory for me. Is that at the end of the course, I ran into the professor in the hall, and he asked me what I was planning to do after my degree. And I said, well, I'm doing a forestry degree. I'm going to go work in forestry. I essentially already had a full-time job lined up at that point. I was at the end of my third year, but I already knew after my fourth year where I would be working and who I would be working for. And he said to me, you should consider applying for a graduate fellowship. And at this point, I didn't even know that research was an option. I didn't know that people worked in professors' labs and did research in professors' labs. I didn't know that you could do research as a career. I didn't know how people became professors. I really had no idea. But him saying this to me and him sort of bringing up this idea that you can be paid to go to school and you can be paid to do research was really eye-opening for me. Yeah, so I think about this as a professor a lot now, because I think I'm not the only student in this situation. And so I try to make sure that I'm thinking about, the students that are getting the information and are excited about the information, and how do we make sure that those students know what their opportunities are? Because it takes, for me, this was not a trajectory that I was on. It took somebody showing a little bit of faith in me and my abilities, so that I started to ask questions about what else I could do and how else I could use my excitement for science rather than going into forestry. And I should say my husband at this point was on his way to becoming a forester, and it's not a disrespect to forestry, but yeah, I sort of felt like maybe I had made an assumption about where I was going and that I hadn't explored all the options. So my next step was essentially to talk to every professor that I could. I talked to them about what they did for research. I talked to them about whether they were accepting graduate students and what students in their lab would do. And I asked if I could get paid to go to graduate school. And that was really important to me. So I knew that I had a full-time job to go to. And so the opportunity cost of going back to school and continuing school, the cost of that, giving up a full-time job, was a really big cost, right? And so it was important to me that I could figure out how to do this and get paid. The other sort of sticking point for me that I've heard has been a sticking point for students in our program as well, students from Syracuse, is that I didn't have the option to move. So I only looked at staying at University of British Columbia for my PhD, because there were logistical challenges with my husband working in the area and not wanting to live separately. Yeah, so in fall of my senior year, fall of my senior year, I was looking for opportunities of what to do in terms of grad school. And I took a course with a guy named Sean Mansfield, who I ended up doing my PhD with. And this guy told the worst jokes ever. And I love bad jokes. So I ended up actually really appreciating him. And I recognized him as somebody who I could potentially work with in terms of personality, because I think that's really important. And he was new faculty, and sometimes new faculty are willing to take risks, and he took a risk on me. So he invited me to do research in his lab in the spring of my senior year, and then I ended up staying there for my PhD. And so I was accepted into a PhD program with essentially no research experience, and that is rare. So if grad school is something that you're thinking about, I strongly encourage you to think about ways to get research experience. But I also think you should never not try to do something because somebody tells you you need something in order to do it. I don't know if that makes sense. But if somebody had said, oh, you have to have done undergraduate research in order to join a PhD program, I would have been like, oh, okay, I guess it's not for me. So remembering that it's okay to try things, even if you don't necessarily meet all of those specific qualifications. So my PhD, I studied very much what I study now. So I studied sort of how wood is formed, so how the secondary cell wall of trees is formed. And the reason that this was important when I did my PhD a long, long time ago was really thinking about pulp and paper. So most timber products, when you logged a tree, you made lumber, you made pulp, you made paper. Those were sort of the predominant things that were done. And so a lot of the work that we did during my PhD was really focused on pulp and paper. But it was very similar. So I studied how two genes that were involved in sucrose metabolism, what happened when you misregulated those, so upregulated them in my case, we broke down more sucrose in the cell, and then the sort of breakdown products of that were used for the production of cellulose. Cellulose is, if you look at a piece of paper, you're essentially looking at cellulose from a tree. And so if you can increase the amount of cellulose in a tree, you can get more pulp out of that tree and produce more paper, and you can make more money off an individual tree. So I started my PhD. As I've said, I worked as a kid on a farm. I tree planted, which was really hard physical work. And I went from doing really hard physical work to doing sort of hard mental work. And that was kind of new for me, right? It was this idea, when you work physically hard, there's sort of a limit to how much you can do. And I think there is mentally as well. And I think sometimes people don't realize that. And so I would get frustrated with myself because I wouldn't be as far along as I would have hoped I would be. But it was kind of this idea that you have to take breaks. You have to look after yourself. Going to school, doing a PhD, working a full-time job, all of those are big tasks. And you need to look after yourself to be successful. So it was very different from anything I had done. I took advantage of opportunities. One of the things that I think about a lot, because I'm still on a university campus, is that we have lots of amazing opportunities on university campuses and on college campuses. There probably is never going to be a time where you have so much access to like super interesting seminars, to seminars that are totally outside your specific research area, but are really interesting. So I worked as a TA. I went to every conference I could go to. I went to talks from like random weird departments. I should say weird departments, random different departments. And I went to like every event. I challenged myself to talk to PIs or to research mentors that were sort of considered unapproachable. And I'm an introvert. And so every time I had to go and make a new connection, it was hard. And one of the things that I did was, so going to conferences or going to meetings, even sort of going to informal events in the department, I would set goals for myself. Like I would say, today, my goal for this event is that I am going to talk to 2 faculty members that I haven't talked to before, or I'm going to talk to 2 researchers in my field that I've never talked to before. And I would go in with specific people in mind and a list of questions in mind. And the reason I say this is that I think at least from my experience, many people who end up in science are fairly introverted, and it can be really hard for us to do these kinds of things. And so I think for me, that was a really good way to actually expand my network and to make sure that I knew the people that I needed to know. So my PhD when did I finish my PhD? In 2008, I finished my PhD. And then I knew that I wanted to go abroad for a postdoc, and I knew that I wanted to experience something different from academia, and I wanted to look at industry a little bit. So I applied for industry jobs, but I also applied for a couple of jobs that were at universities but had connections to industry. And we had, so again, my husband and I had a few, I guess, requirements. So we didn't want to go to a country where business was not conducted in English, because my husband also would have to find a job. I think in academia, there's a lot of flexibility, and you can go many places in the world. And we're sort of very fortunate that a lot of science is conducted in English, but that's not the same for all fields. And so my husband said it needs to be an English-speaking country, or a country where business is conducted in English. And so we went to Australia, and I did a postdoc there. That was a combination between academia and industry. And so I worked at a university. I worked at Queensland University of Technology on a project that was funded by a company called Syngenta. And Syngenta is a major ag biotech company. And they sort of set the goals of they were working with QUT, the university, because of technology that had been developed at QUT, but in the industry partner really set the goals of the research. And it opened my eyes to the difference sort of between industry and academia, in that in academia, there's a lot of freedom to choose what you want to do and what research you want to do. It's a little bit more, I would say it's slower paced, but there's other things that you have to do, right? So you have to teach courses, you have to engage with students. But those were all things that I was excited about. And so this time sort of doing this postdoc was a really good time for me, because it allowed me to sort of realize that I probably wanted to go to academia if I could get that opportunity. But I also loved working. One of the things that I loved about the project that I was in is that we had these meetings where we just talked about science, and we spent so much time talking about science and really thinking about the things that we were working on. And I loved that aspect of it. I do sort of miss that in academia, because there's such broad topics of research in our department that I don't necessarily get those sort of big conversations. So like I said, I was also passionate, and I realized this at the time, that I really was passionate about mentoring students. And so in Australia, there's this kind of different system where postdocs can actually mentor PhD students. And so I got to mentor my first PhD student in Australia. One of the things I love is supporting students to meet their goals. And that's sort of, like I said, how I knew I needed to stay in academia. I will say, somebody once mentioned that there should be that everybody should have to show their failures sometimes. Somebody once wrote, or if you Google online, you can find a CV of failures where somebody was gracious enough to list all of the grants that they haven't gotten, all of the papers that have been rejected. And everybody has those situations. And I think one of those things for me was my first job interview out of my postdoc. So I was looking for a faculty position, and my first interview was pretty terrible. In my notes, I've called it a terrible stinker. But I learned. And then my next two were successful, and I had 2 offers for faculty positions, and Syracuse was a better fit for many reasons that I can explain right away. But one of the things that this reminded me of recently is I saw a note that said something like, you don't win or lose, you win or learn, right? So you can take, and this is what I did, right? I took this situation where I knew I had bombed. I left the interview and felt pretty terrible. And I got the letter that was like, thanks, but no thanks. And I actually called the guy who had organized my interview, and I said, look, I recognize there were some places where I didn't do very well. Can you tell me what I didn't do well as well? And we talked about it, and he had lots of good advice. And a lot of it I had already known myself, but there were a couple of things that I was like, oh, that makes sense to me. And I was able to take that and transfer it to my next interviews, and was more successful. Yeah, and I tell my students this all the time because, you know, you don't do well on assignment. You apply for, you know, a summer opportunity and you don't get it. We all have those things. And probably the more successful someone is, the more of those things they have. So don't get discouraged. So I've been in Syracuse for almost 12 years. Syracuse was a good fit for me because they were building, or they were talking about sort of trying to create a focus around bioenergy. So I talked about how my research fits into the pulp and paper industry, but in the last sort of 2 decades, I would say, the switch, there's really been a switch that in looking at plants and plant material from the perspective of producing fuel, or producing energy. And so a lot of my work sort of has that focus now, where we're interested in wood formation because wood can be used for the production of energy. And so it was really good fit at Syracuse University. I've been here, like I said, for 12 years. I feel like the last 12 years have been really exciting. I've had both personal and work things happen. So in the past 12 years, I've had 2 kids, gotten a major federal grant, gotten smaller grants. I've been awarded tenure. And then now, more recently, I became the associate chair, and I've started to do things that are a little bit different from sort of that starting faculty position. And I think that's part of what makes this job exciting, and that's part of what makes any career exciting, is this opportunity to pivot and to look for new opportunities. And I think this sort of is where I'm going to close, because this is where I'm at now. But I think this is sort of one of the themes from my career, is this idea that I started out thinking I was going to be a teacher. And it's funny because I am a teacher in a way, but I'm doing so many other different things as well. And I never would have done these things if, you know, someone hadn't talked to me and said, hey, you should consider this other opportunity. If I hadn't taken risks and applied for things when I maybe wasn't the top candidate for, maybe I didn't hit all those boxes, but I took a risk and applied anyway. I pushed myself to do things that were uncomfortable. And I've ended up in a place that I love. Like I love my job. I love the opportunities that I'm looking at right now. And you should know that even if you pick a career and you end up in a job tomorrow, you don't have to do the same thing forever. Yeah, and that's my journey.
Well, thank you, Dr. Coleman, for being so honest and humble and sharing I like this, the learning opportunities. They're not failures, they're learning opportunities. And absolutely, I try to share with my students times when things did not work out for me, because they see the finished product. They see us standing there, doctor, whatever, teaching them about things that they may or may not care about, and then they leave. But I think it's very important to show them that our path was not straight and narrow. It had bends and curves and some dead ends. And so I think we have yet to have a speaker who had these straight and narrow paths. So I doubt that it actually exists. A couple of questions. There's something you said where you talked about opportunity costs, that you very much understood that continuing your education may come at a real financial cost. And this is an issue that so many of our students face, because often it is a choice between, am I going to take these classes or am I going to take 2 extra shifts on at work?
Yeah.
And sometimes the math does not work out, and it's a really tough decision.
Yeah.
And sometimes, and the payoff sometimes is far down the road, right? The promise of you will get a better job in 4 years does not pay for the groceries today or next week. So if you could go back and sort of sit yourself down, what are some things that you would tell yourself?
Oh, that's a good question. So it's also an interesting question, because the cohort that I went through university with, I think it's probably demographically a little bit like Syracuse University, right? So there were people that had a lot of money to do a lot of things, and during my undergraduate degree, I really scrimped and saved, right? I worked throughout my degree, and so I do recognize that. If I had advice, I look sometimes at the data, right? So there's a comparison between earning potential with a degree and without a degree. Yeah, but I don't have a good answer, right? I think you can see the data, you can see that education is worth it. But I think it's a very hard thing for many people to navigate.
And right, I'm asking you to solve a problem here that many other people have not been, right? If we could solve this problem, so many of our students would just say, great, I'll take all these classes. And I absolutely agree. And when you said, well, I worked all through undergrad, no, you planted blood dripping trees in the cold northern forests. I worked at McDonald's and I thought that was hard, but you win first prize here for probably the hardest job I have yet to have somebody tell me about.
Grossest job anyway.
Yes.
That part was gross.
There's sparse showers, lots of twigs and seeds. And I have actually seen a video of somebody planting these trees, and it is the back-breaking work. You bend down thousands of times. So to say that you worked hard during undergrad is probably an understatement.
It gets worse, Lacey. This is a really horrible story that thankfully ended in the best way possible, but somebody on my crew was actually mauled by a black bear while we were working. So there were hazards as well. So, and thankfully they are fine, but it was a scary, yeah.
Well, so thankfully no black bear maulings anywhere near Syracuse right now. But wow, what a journey with twists and turns that were rather unexpected, such as the planting of new, what are they, boreal forests in middle Canada. Now, you mentioned the student population at Syracuse University and OCC. They're a little different.
Yep.
But I'm going to sort of hazard to say that you were more like an OCC student. You did not walk into the University of British Columbia with a lot of financial backing or even intellectual backing. Neither of your parents pursued higher education. So you kind of came from a place where you had to sort of scrape through and figure it out on your own. And that's many of our students. Yeah. What would you like to share with them?
Yeah, that's a good question. In fact, so we share a campus with SUNY ESF. And I also see myself a lot in the SUNY ESF students. And so sometimes ESF students are in our classroom. And one year I had an SU student make a comment about those forestry students. And I was like, so my background's forestry. Do we want to have a conversation about this? But that's a really good question. So I think probably the thing that was most important to my success at university was going and talking to professors. And I know this feels really cliche because I tell my students all the time, like go to office hours, go to tutorials. That honestly got me through my degree. So I said I did well in my courses. It's true. It's also a little bit of a lie because every week for calculus, every office hour, I sat there with my professor and worked through problems. And they were immensely patient with me. Calculus was clearly not my thing, but I spent a lot of time one-on-one with my professors. Yeah.
That I will join that train of calculus not being my strong suit. And I tell my students all the time, just because it's hard does not mean you can't do it.
Yeah.
It just means you have to work hard at it. And I tell them, I was like, I got some bad grades because the classes were hard, and just because they're not getting A's does not mean they can't be successful.
Yeah.
We have a question from a student, and it is, he's looking for some advice on, has a bachelor's degree, but looking to switch careers into more of a STEM field with an emphasis on environmental science. Where can they start?
Oh, a bachelor's degree.
But not in science.
Bachelor's. Okay, not in science.
Yeah.
That's a really good question. I probably would start, depending on what your current degree is, looking for opportunities that where your current degree applies. So, just as an example, sort of, there's environmental science or environmental companies that do environmental work that require other types of staff, right? And so looking for those kinds of opportunities. I think if you're looking to go back to school, yeah, that's a really good question. I don't know. I think finding opportunities to volunteer. I think looking for opportunities that match your current training with an opportunity that would expand your experience. So like looking for either volunteer opportunities or jobs that give you exposure to that field, because that's something, I mean, really that's a way to get contacts in those fields, and also to start to get information and knowledge about those fields, right? Like sort of official training. So that's where I would start.
Yeah, and the student shared that the current degree is in music, and they're having a hard time getting any bites on applications, which is understandable, but I would agree to find some opportunities and to look who the big employers are. I know locally, the New York State employs a lot of environmental type positions,
Yep.
and there are those adjacent positions like somebody has to write the grants for the environmental studies, right? Someone has to make the community information leaflets that go out about the environmental projects. So yeah, I get persistence.
Yeah, and the other thing I would say, just as you're saying this, is thinking about transferable skills, right? So you might write down that you have a degree in music, but you're not writing down sort of the dedication and focus that playing an instrument or whatever type of music you're doing requires, right? And so thinking about what skills do you have that are transferable across fields when you're looking for opportunities, and spelling those out, because sometimes employers people accepting graduate students or whatever direction you're taking, sometimes it's easier to read something really quickly and be like, oh, that doesn't really fit. But I think if you can sort of draw the connections, if you can say, these are skills that I have because of the experiences that I have, and this is how I see they're relevant to what you do, that's a great thing to put in a cover letter.
I agree. And also to pull in something you said, where you had all this tree experience, but it was not academic.
Yeah.
Right. You had physical hands-on tree experience. So when searching for a job, yes, they will look at academics, but also, have you hiked all the 46 peaks in the Adirondacks? Put that on there, right? Show them why you are interested in this. Show them that you have all this non-academic experience if it applies. But yeah, it's and I understand the desire to switch into a career. There's a lot of attractive jobs in STEM, often correlating with good pay. And it is finding that entry can be tough. So as we start in on sort of closing our seminar hour, any parting words that you have for our students?
Oh, I think I've kind of already said it, but I think just don't miss out on opportunities because you think you don't meet the criteria. And I think this is really relevant, I guess, to this one student question too, right? I feel like if I listed out all of the times I've been rejected, it would be a lot. But the number of times that I've been successful has been enough, right? And it's gotten to me to a place that I love and to a place where I'm really happy. And so I think not giving up, if there's something you want to do, keep striving for it, and figure out the steps you need to do in order to get where you want to go.
Well, thank you very much for taking the time to come and talk to our students today. If anybody would like to get in touch with Dr. Coleman, please send me an email and I will be sure to set up that connection, and keep an eye out for additional seminars throughout the semester. Bye-bye.